The handcuffs clicked shut around Sheriff Marcus Whitmore's own wrists as he sat alone in his office at 3 a.m., officially placing himself under arrest for a crime that would make the townspeople of Cedar Springs question everything they thought they knew about justice. What he had done in that jail cell 3 hours earlier would either destroy his career forever or prove that sometimes the law and justice were two completely different things. Marcus Whitmore had been the sheriff of Cedar Springs, Colorado, for 15 years, earning a reputation as one of the most reliable and principled lawmen in the territory. At 42 years old, he was known for his methodical approach to investigations, his fair treatment of prisoners, and his unwavering commitment to upholding the law exactly as it was written. The townspeople trusted him completely, and his arrest record was impeccable. Every case he brought to trial resulted in conviction because Marcus never arrested anyone unless he had ironclad evidence of their guilt. Cedar Springs had grown from a small mining camp to a prosperous town of nearly 2,000 residents during Marcus's tenure as sheriff, and much of that growth was attributed to the sense of safety and order he maintained. Businesses flourished because merchants knew their properties were protected. Families settled permanently because parents felt confident raising children in a community where the law was respected and enforced. Even the roughest elements of frontier society gave Cedar Springs a wide berth because they knew Sheriff Whitmore didn't negotiate with criminals. But on the night of October 15th, 1884, Marcus faced a situation that would test every principle he had lived by for his entire career. 3 prisoners sat in his jail cells, and by morning, federal marshals would arrive to escort them to Denver for trial. On the surface, this seemed like routine business. Marcus had arrested the men for cattle rustling, gathered sufficient evidence to secure convictions, and followed proper procedures for transferring them to federal custody. What made this night different was what Marcus had discovered about the true nature of their alleged crimes. The 3 men in his jail were William Chun, a Chinese immigrant who had been working as a ranch hand for local cattle baron Harrison Steele; Samuel Running Bear, a Cheyenne man who had been employed as a tracker and guide for the same ranch; and Thomas Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who served as Steele's head foreman. Marcus had arrested them based on evidence provided by Steele himself. Horse tracks leading from Steele's property to a hidden canyon where stolen cattle had been found, along with personal items belonging to all 3 men that appeared to link them to the theft. The case had seemed straightforward when Marcus first investigated it 2 weeks earlier. Harrison Steele was one of the most prominent and respected citizens in Cedar Springs, a man who owned over 10,000 acres of prime grazing land and employed dozens of workers from the local community. When Steele reported that nearly 200 head of cattle had been stolen from his ranch, Marcus had responded immediately with a full investigation. The evidence Steele provided appeared to be conclusive. The stolen cattle were found exactly where Steele said they would be, and the personal items found at the scene clearly belonged to the 3 accused men. Marcus had followed standard procedures in making the arrests, ensuring that proper warrants were obtained and that the accused men were treated fairly throughout the process. All 3 men had maintained their innocence, but their claims seemed impossible to believe given the physical evidence against them. William Chun insisted that he had been working in the ranch's eastern pastures on the day the cattle were allegedly stolen, but Steele testified that Chun had requested time off and had not been seen on the property that day. Samuel Running Bear claimed that he had been tracking wolves for Steele in the northern mountains, but again, Steele contradicted this account. Thomas Kowalski swore that he had been supervising fence repairs near the ranch house, but Steele provided testimony that Kowalski had been absent from work without explanation. The federal charges were serious enough to result in lengthy prison sentences or even execution, depending on the judge's interpretation of territorial law regarding organized cattle theft. Marcus knew that all 3 men faced bleak futures, but he also believed that justice required him to present the evidence he had gathered regardless of the personal consequences for the accused. His job was to enforce the law, not to make moral judgments about whether the law was fair or just in individual cases. But everything changed on the night of October 14th, when Marcus made a routine inspection of his prisoners and discovered something that would shatter his understanding of the case. Thomas Kowalski had developed a severe fever during the day, and by evening he was delirious with illness. As Marcus checked on him, Kowalski began speaking in rambling, disconnected sentences that initially seemed like meaningless fever dreams. However, as Marcus listened more carefully, he realized that Kowalski was unconsciously revealing details about the case that didn't match the official story. In his delirium, Kowalski spoke about Harrison's plan and the real thieves getting away and those poor cattle already sold in Denver before we ever got arrested. Most chillingly, he mumbled about bodies in the canyon where they found the cattle and Harrison saying dead men can't testify. Marcus initially dismissed these utterances as the product of a sick man's confused mind, but something about the specificity of the details made him decide to investigate further. Marcus spent the rest of that night reviewing every piece of evidence in the case, looking for inconsistencies he might have missed. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The personal items that had been found at the scene, a distinctive knife belonging to William Chun, a beaded bracelet that Samuel Running Bear always wore, and a pocket watch that had been Thomas Kowalski's father's most prized possession, were all items that the men would never have willingly parted with, and certainly not items they would have carelessly left behind if they were actually stealing cattle. More disturbing was Marcus's realization that Harrison Steele had been unusually eager to provide evidence and testimony against his own employees. In most cases involving theft by ranch hands, employers were reluctant to prosecute because it reflected poorly on their judgment in hiring. But Steele had not only provided evidence, he had actively encouraged Marcus to pursue the most serious possible charges against the three men. Marcus decided to conduct a more thorough investigation of the canyon where the stolen cattle had been found. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks in a remote section of the canyon, Marcus found the partially buried remains of three men. Their clothing and personal effects identified them as ranch hands who had disappeared from various properties throughout the territory over the past 2 years. All three had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. The horrific discovery forced Marcus to reconstruct the entire case from a completely different perspective. Harrison Steele had not been the victim of cattle theft. He had been orchestrating a complex operation that involved stealing cattle from his own ranch, selling them through criminal contacts in Denver, and then framing innocent employees for the thefts. The three men currently in Marcus's jail were not cattle thieves. They were witnesses who had discovered Steele's operation and were about to be silenced permanently. Marcus realized that the stolen cattle found in the canyon had been placed there by Steele himself as evidence. The personal items belonging to Chun, Running Bear, and Kowalski had been stolen from them and planted at the scene. Most chillingly, Marcus understood that Steele's plan involved having the three men shot while attempting to escape during their transfer to Denver. Federal marshals would arrive in the morning expecting to transport dangerous criminals, and they would have no reason to question Steele's account if the prisoners were killed during an alleged escape attempt. The evidence of Steele's crimes was overwhelming, but Marcus faced an impossible legal situation. The three innocent men in his jail were scheduled to be transferred to federal custody in less than 6 hours. Once they left his jurisdiction, Marcus would have no power to protect them, and by the time he could present evidence of Steele's crimes to federal authorities, Chun, Running Bear, and Kowalski would likely be dead. Marcus spent the next hour considering his options, all of which seemed to require him to choose between upholding the law and preventing the murder of three innocent men. He could release the prisoners, but that would make him guilty of obstruction of justice and would likely result in their immediate recapture by federal marshals who would assume Marcus had been corrupted or intimidated. He could attempt to contact federal authorities immediately, but the nearest telegraph office was closed until morning, and any delay in the transfer would raise suspicions that might result in the prisoners being killed even sooner. The decision Marcus ultimately made would define not only his career, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve justice. At 2:30 a.m. on October 15th, 1884, Sheriff Marcus Whitmore unlocked the cells containing William Chun, Samuel Running Bear, and Thomas Kowalski. He provided them with horses, supplies, and detailed directions to a remote cabin in the mountains where they could hide until he could present evidence of their innocence to federal authorities. In helping the three men escape, Marcus was technically guilty of obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting fugitives, and violating his oath of office. But he also knew that allowing them to be transferred to federal custody would result in their deaths, and that Harrison Steele would continue his criminal operation with 3 more murders added to his account. After ensuring that the prisoners had a sufficient head start, Marcus returned to his office and began preparing the paperwork that would officially charge him with multiple felonies. He wrote out a detailed confession explaining his actions, documented all the evidence he had discovered regarding Harrison Steele's crimes, and formally placed himself under arrest. When his deputy arrived for the morning shift, he found Sheriff Marcus Whitmore sitting in his own jail cell, having locked himself inside and thrown the keys onto his desk. The events that followed Marcus's self-arrest created a sensation that extended far beyond Cedar Springs. When federal marshals arrived to transport the escaped prisoners, they instead found themselves dealing with a sheriff who had confessed to helping them escape and who was demanding to be prosecuted for his crimes. The evidence Marcus presented against Harrison Steele forced federal authorities to launch a comprehensive investigation that ultimately revealed the full scope of Steele's criminal operation. The investigation confirmed every detail of Marcus's account. Harrison Steele had been operating a cattle theft ring for over 3 years, stealing livestock from his own ranch and selling it through criminal contacts in Denver while framing innocent employees for the thefts. The bodies found in the canyon were identified as former Steele employees who had discovered his operation and been murdered to ensure their silence. Additional evidence linked Steele to similar crimes throughout the territory, making him one of the most prolific and dangerous criminals in the region. William Chun, Samuel Running Bear, and Thomas Kowalski were completely exonerated of all charges. They voluntarily returned to Cedar Springs to testify against Steele once Marcus had guaranteed their safety through federal protection. Their testimony, combined with the physical evidence Marcus had gathered, resulted in Steele's conviction on multiple charges of murder, cattle theft, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to death and executed 6 months later. The legal proceedings surrounding Marcus's case proved to be equally complex and precedent-setting. Prosecutors were faced with the unusual situation of a law enforcement officer who had clearly violated his oath of office, but had done so to prevent multiple murders and expose a major criminal operation. Legal scholars from throughout the territory debated whether Marcus's actions constituted heroic civil disobedience or criminal behavior that threatened the foundations of law and order. The judge assigned to Marcus's case ultimately ruled that while his actions had technically violated federal law, the circumstances justified a suspended sentence with no jail time. The court recognized that Marcus had faced an impossible choice between following legal procedures and preventing the murder of innocent men, and that his decision to arrest himself demonstrated his respect for the legal system even when he felt compelled to violate it. Marcus's case became a landmark precedent in discussions about the relationship between law and justice in frontier communities. Legal scholars used his example to argue that rigid adherence to procedural law could sometimes conflict with the fundamental purpose of a justice system, which was to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Law enforcement officers throughout the territory studied Marcus's case as an example of the complex moral choices that sometimes faced those charged with upholding justice in imperfect systems. The townspeople of Cedar Springs were initially divided in their response to Marcus's actions. Some felt betrayed that their trusted sheriff had violated his oath of office, even for noble reasons. Others argued that Marcus had demonstrated extraordinary courage and integrity by risking his career to save innocent lives. The debate that ensued forced the entire community to examine their understanding of the relationship between legal authority and moral responsibility. Over time, however, public opinion shifted strongly in Marcus's favor as the full scope of Harrison Steele's crimes became known. The discovery that one of the town's most respected citizens had been a serial killer and criminal mastermind shocked residents and made them grateful that Marcus had been willing to risk everything to expose the truth. The three men whose lives Marcus had saved became prominent members of the community, and their success stories served as powerful reminders of what would have been lost if Marcus had chosen to follow procedures rather than his conscience. Marcus continued to serve as sheriff of Cedar Springs for another 12 years, earning even greater respect from the community for his moral courage. His reputation extended far beyond his own jurisdiction, and he was frequently consulted by other law enforcement agencies facing similar ethical dilemmas. He became known throughout the territory as a man who understood that true justice sometimes required personal sacrifice and the courage to make difficult choices. The case also had broader implications for law enforcement practices throughout the American frontier. Marcus's experience demonstrated the importance of giving local officials sufficient authority and resources to investigate complex crimes thoroughly before transferring cases to federal jurisdiction. It also highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between local and federal authorities to prevent criminals from exploiting jurisdictional gaps. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus's story became a powerful reminder that justice and law, while closely related, were not always identical. His willingness to accept personal consequences for his actions while working to expose the truth showed that true justice sometimes required individuals to transcend the limitations of legal systems and act on principle rather than procedure. The legacy of Sheriff Marcus Whitmore's self-arrest extended far beyond his own career and community. Law enforcement academies throughout the country began using his case as a teaching tool for discussions about ethics and moral courage in police work. His example inspired generations of officers to remember that their ultimate loyalty should be to justice rather than to bureaucratic procedures, and that protecting the innocent sometimes required taking personal risks. Legal historians have noted that Marcus's case represented a turning point in discussions about civil disobedience and moral authority in American jurisprudence. His willingness to accept punishment for violating unjust procedures while working to expose greater injustices provided a model for later civil rights activists and reformers who faced similar conflicts between legal requirements and moral imperatives. The three men whose lives Marcus saved, William Chun, Samuel Running Bear, and Thomas Kowalski, all went on to establish successful businesses and families in Cedar Springs. They never forgot the sheriff who had risked everything to save them from false accusations and certain death. Their descendants continued to honor Marcus's memory, and the story of his courage was passed down through generations as an example of what it truly meant to serve justice. Marcus himself rarely spoke publicly about his decision to arrest himself, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. When pressed by journalists and legal scholars to explain his reasoning, he would simply say that he had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that sometimes protecting the innocent required accepting personal consequences. He maintained that any law enforcement officer faced with similar circumstances should be prepared to make the same choice. The sheriff who arrested himself proved that true justice sometimes requires the courage to stand against the system you serve when that system fails to protect the innocent. His story reminds us that laws are created by human beings and therefore can be imperfect, but that the principles of justice, protecting the innocent, punishing the guilty, and seeking truth are eternal and worth any personal sacrifice. Marcus Whitmore's legacy lived on in the improved procedures and ethical guidelines that were implemented throughout territorial law enforcement as a result of his case. His courage in the face of an impossible choice became a symbol of the moral complexity that defines the difference between mere law enforcement and true justice. He showed that sometimes the most important arrests are the ones that force us to examine our own consciences and ask whether we have the courage to do what is right rather than what is safe. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of moral courage and impossible choices, hit that subscribe button because we got many more tales of individuals who face the ultimate test of their principles waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that true heroism sometimes requires standing against the very institutions you've sworn to serve, proving that justice and law don't always walk the same path.